welcome our Ginger Held, President of the Grafman Endowment Club. This is part 2 of our legacy luncheons, focusing on Rabbi Wright and welcoming him as our senior rabbi. Our thanks go out to Ronnie Hess for her input in bringing this wonderful idea to us as part of your introduction, Rabbi, to our temple family. We want to welcome any other new members who are also joining us along with Rabbi Wright today. We hope you will grow to love this congregation as much as so many of us do. In September, Rabbi, we got a glimpse into your life beyond the beam. Today, we want to share with you Temple Emanu-El's beautiful history. And we have called upon our resident historians, Robert Levin and Lester Seigel, to do this for us. The two of them will bring to life stories that I know will put smiles on most of our faces. All right, guys, floor is yours.
Sorry. What you do when you walk up here and sing. Good afternoon, everybody. It is a pleasure to be here and talk about this beautiful place. My task is to, as quickly as possible, bring you to about half of the temple's history. And I get the fun half, which is the beginning. And hopefully you'll find it entertaining, and hopefully you'll find it a little bit informative, and then Robert's going to be saving the better for the last. So all the great stories are coming with him. So anyway, it is great to be here. I do this sort of for a living, but usually about music, and so it's really hard for me to not teach, and so just bear with me if there's no notes and there's no exam, so just kind of hang in and I'll try to keep it good, okay? Temple Emanu-El organized in 1882. The thing about it is that these points really still, how much of what the temple began resonates with the congregation as we know it in 2019. The imprint of what founded Temple Emanu-El is still a part and still so relevant in so many ways. It's tied to the city of Birmingham. Birmingham was founded in 1871, so it was a very young town. It was reputed to have more saloons than houses of worship in those days, and it was not a city burdened by the legacy of the Civil War. As a post-bellum city, it was looking forward. It was about not agrarian economy, but about manufacturing. It was about land speculation, big time. It was about being a company town to some big interest in Pittsburgh, but it was a town on the move. It was a town that was focused in growth. It's interesting that the generation that founded Temple Emanu-El were young adults, single men who came here to seek their fortune in a new, thriving southern city, and or families with young children. It was not an Orthodox congregation that retreaded into Reform, as so many of the early Reform congregations in bigger cities in the Northeast did, in New York, elsewhere, where they were Orthodox congregations and then moved themselves. That's a whole different kind of birth. But this was a Reform congregation and an American Reform congregation from the get-go. Children were everywhere in this congregation from its earliest days. And as the city grew exponentially, the congregation grew with it. They were merchants, overwhelmingly. They were in the banking business. They were in positions to assume mantles of civic leadership, which they did. And that is a big story about Temple Emanu-El from its very earliest days. The first president of Temple Emanu-El was Ike Hochstetter. He came from Arkansas, and he was in a couple of businesses in Birmingham, but he owned a tavern, and he owned a store, and he was a single man when he came here. And he was elected the first president when the congregation was chartered in the old Masonic Hall downtown. There was no building, of course, no synagogue, and there wouldn't be for a while. This is 1882. And the first thing that the congregation did was what Jewish congregations tended to do everywhere. They bought land for a cemetery. Before they built a synagogue, you bought land for a cemetery. Because people were going to need the cemetery before they got around to raising money for the synagogue, let's face it. And so having a consecrated area for Jews to be buried was job one. We still own that land. It's just north of Parker High School. We call it the North Side Cemetery, and it's still there to this day. So this was the first person. He did not stay in Birmingham. After the incorporation of Temple Emanu-El, he moved away soon thereafter. But I have to tell you, every time I hear his name on the Kaddish list, he feels like mishpacha. And I don't think he's got any connections in Birmingham anymore. But you never know. You see some of these names and you just kind of go, oh yeah, first president of Temple Emanu-El. How cool is that? We kind of look alike now that I'm looking at it. But probably Ike Hochstatter was typical of the early founding members of Temple Emanu-El in that we were what was known in Yiddish as Deutschen. We were Jews from Hungary, from Germany, from Austria primarily. And that was the heritage, and that was not my family. After the congregation was founded in the 1880s and 90s, the Russians came and the Poles came, and we had all of that. And so I was part of that group that came. My family comes here about 1901, and they're peddlers, and they're selling piece goods in Bessemer, Alabama, because you've got a lot of blue-collar people, you know, who need, when they get payday, you know, they come and they buy the stuff. So that was me. We were the Orthodox. We were helped by the already established German, our crowd Jews. But we founded, the Orthodox Synagogue Knesset Israel, soon after Emanu-El. Emanu-El was the first Jewish congregation in the city of Birmingham. But soon after came the Orthodox congregation. Everybody lived on the north side in those days. The Reformed Jews began migrating south to the suburbs of Highland Avenue and Five Points. This was the promised land right here. Highland Avenue was paved with gold. Not. But at any rate, you know. But this was the new place to come. And but the congregation grew, and over time, they had their first High Holy Day services in O'Brien's Opera House downtown, with old Captain Frank O'Brien as the music director. And the papers were full of the fact that there was a fabulous choir under Captain Frank O'Brien's leadership. 1 Methodist, 2 Episcopalians, a Baptist, 1 Jew. It was a glorious sound. It was probably okay, because I guarantee you most of the stuff they sang was in English. And I will tell you also, they probably read out of Isaac Mayer Wise's prayer book called Minhag America, which was the book he wrote for American Reform Judaism. The reason I surmise that is because of the student rabbi who was engaged to do the High Holy Day services that first year in 1882. He was Joseph Stoltz, and he was from the Northeast, and he enrolled in Rabbi Wise's Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, and he came down to do the services. He actually does look a lot like my grandfather, I gotta tell you. But at any rate, he was from a very traditional Jewish family. He graduated in 1884, 2 years after he was in Birmingham. He was from Syracuse, I'm looking at my notes now. And he spent most of his career, and he had quite a career. He was president of the Central Conference of American Rabbis right at the turn of the century. And most of his association was with two of the big congregations in Chicago. So he was somebody. He was a real disciple of Rabbi Wise. And Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise was so identified with this congregation and the style of this temple. All right, so that's his story. Instead of Rabbi Stoltz, that he began every morning on his personal devotions reading from Minhag America, which is why I'm sort of thinking maybe that was the source of maybe the first prayer book that we had, because the Union prayer book had not been published yet, not at that time. So he was the very first rabbinical presence that we had here. Now, in 1886, for 4 months, we had Rabbi Alexander Rosenspitz. Rosenspitz was born in Hungary and was trained there. He was not, repeat not, trained at the Hebrew Union College. Rabbi Wise, in his autobiography, which is fascinating and mostly true, described the type of rabbi in those days as using the Hebrew term kolbo, which I think sort of today is translated one-stop shopping. You know, kolbo is a phrase that I have been explained means you can get everything under one roof. And I think what Wise meant was that these guys were everything. They were cantors, they were rabbis, they were, you know, they could organize the school, they could lead the service, they could, you know, whatever needed done, they were all in one. The ordination may not be terribly documentable, and we may not be able to produce a certificate, but, you know, he has experience. This guy really had experience. I took a little time in my research to sort of trace Rabbi Rosenspitz around. He was everywhere. If my PowerPoint is going to permit me to see my notes, yes. Where do we see Rabbi Rose? This is like, where's Waldo? Where is Alex? In 1868 to 1870, he was at Temple B'nai Israel of Galveston. 1871, founded at Omaha's Temple Israel. In 1875, he co-officiated the dedication ceremonies for the new Temple Bethel of San Antonio. Served Nashville's Ave Shalom in 1876 to 78. You see the trajectory? It's like, you know, he's moving closer. But then B'nai Zion of Titusville, Pennsylvania. You know this town? I don't know. Titusville, Pennsylvania. Beth Israel of Portland, Oregon. From 1881 to 1883, and we get him for 4 months in 1886. This is a man who lives out of a suitcase. This is a kobo. This was the state of much of the rabbinate in America in this age. He looks like a very distinguished gentleman. Unfortunately, he wasn't here long enough to really know. In 1889, Temple was able to build its first synagogue on the corner of 5th Avenue and 17th Street, which is right across from today's Kelly Ingram Park. And there's a brand new building on that corner that they just finished. I don't know if you've noticed. This building was too small for Temple Emanu-El by the time it was dedicated. The congregation had outgrown it by the time it was dedicated. It's hard to tell, but I would imagine if you've been to B'nai Sholem in Huntsville, which is an old sanctuary building, it was probably on that scale. Not a terribly large sanctuary like we think about today. You can't really see the little Russian Kremlin type minaret, but it's echoed here because this, of course, is the arch facade from this building that is in the photograph. This is it. So we kept a little bit of it. We also kept the cornerstone, which is around the corner. Robert, are you going to tell the Ner Tamid? Okay, I'm going to leave that alone. But anyway, this was the great house of worship for Emanu-El, our Beit Tefillah. And there it is. When we moved out before World War I, it was sold to a church, and then by 1940 it had been torn down. Kind of always wished I'd seen it. Now, the first full-time rabbi called by Temple Emanu-El was Maurice Eisenberg. 1887, and he served here for 3 years until 1890. He was born in Königsberg, which today is Kaliningrad, up in the Danzig corridor, which sometimes is Germany and sometimes is Russia. Since the Soviet Union, it's been Russia. But way up there in the Baltic. And he was born there, and his family moved to America. He also was not a Hebrew Union College graduate, so he was another rabbi who comes sort of in this way. Eisenberg was, like I said, the first full-time person that Emanu-El had. And we don't know a whole lot about his tenure here, except he was evidently a cantor, a trained cantor. He also, we have minutes from the temple board minutes that Rabbi Eisenberg got in some hot water because the choir came to the board with a complaint that they were rehearsing, and Rabbi Eisenberg was crashing the rehearsals and telling the choir director how it should be done. And the board admonished Rabbi Rosenberg, with all due respect, to leave the choir alone and let them do their job. And this resonates with me for some reason. I just feel like this is a great progressive move on the part of our board of trustees. But the other thing that makes this is that he was trained as a cantor, and also some of you who are really into this kind of thing might know or appreciate the fact that his son, who was also named Maurice Eisenberg, was a very famous American cellist. He studied with Pablo Casals, he taught at Juilliard, and he was for many years part of the Menuhin trio with Yehudi Menuhin, violin, and Menuhin's wife, Hepzibah, who was the pianist, and he was the cellist. And they have recordings, and last night on my iPad I was listening to Maurice Eisenberg Jr. playing Tchaikovsky with the Menuhins. And that kind of gave me chills. At any rate, that was it. He resigned here in 1900. In 1902, we know he was in Butte, Montana. All I'll say is that his departure from Emanu-El was due to some unpleasantness. And I think that's all we need to say. But the fact that he ended up in Butte, Montana may tell you what you need to know. All right. Something like that. Here is something I found. Rabbi Eisenberg kept a notebook, a musical notebook, and he notated musical chant and songs. His son turned this over to an archive at University of North Carolina in Greensboro. And you can flip through pages of this, and it's fascinating. I thought I would just show you a page of Rabbi Eisenberg's that came down to his son, and the front cover says Father's Tunes, written in, I guess, the son's handwriting. It's very sweet. The 90s were not good for Temple Emanu-El financially. The Panic of 1893 was made felt in Birmingham. If it wasn't good for Pittsburgh, it wasn't good for Birmingham. So at any rate, the temple found itself unable to hire a rabbi after the departure of Eisenberg, and for 4 years, Samuel Ullman, who was a lay member of the congregation, was a president of the temple, had been in the hardware business from Natchez, Mississippi, was a Civil War veteran for the Confederacy, and a native of Germany, came here, and he had Jewish knowledge, and he was able to guide the congregation. He was an enormously respected person. Talking about the civic involvement of this congregation, Ullman served on the school board. He was fundamental in establishing the public schools in the city of Birmingham. And we could talk about the famous poem he wrote that was made famous because Douglas MacArthur had a framed copy in his office in the Philippines. And since the natives of that region tended to name their children after MacArthur, that poem, especially in Japan, took on a life of its own. And we have so many tourists from around the world who come to the Ullman home just behind Temple Bethel, which is now preserved as it was. So Samuel Ullman was pivotal in this, and enough good can't be said for the fact that he kept this congregation going at a critical time. We would be remiss if we didn't mention the 19-year presidency of Bernard Steiner, who with his brother founded Steiner Bank in Birmingham, and that had a little something to do with our stability too. The next classy rabbi we got from was a Hebrew Union College graduate, the second full-time rabbi of Temple Emanu-El, David Marks. Everything about David Marks, he was a great catch, as the matchmaker would say. He was distinguished, he was learned, he was a disciple of the American Reform training. He only served 1 year, however, because a better job opened up at the temple in Atlanta. And you know how that goes. So after 1 year, he left Temple Emanu-El, and but he did a very good thing. He recommended a classmate. He said, look at this guy Newfield. Look at Morris Newfield. He's my buddy from Cincinnati. Check him out. So he did that. Now, I don't know much about Rabbi Marks, but I will tell you one story from Atlanta. When Rabbi Marks served with distinction at the temple in Atlanta, and he finally retired, and he was succeeded by a rabbi of Grafman's generation named Jacob Rothschild. And Rothschild also had a long tenure at the temple, including he was there when the bombing, all that happened in the later years. But there's a great story that Rothschild used to tell, that one of his early Friday afternoons, he's there, he's alone at the temple, everybody's gone, and it's, services are coming soon, and he walks through the sanctuary and he sees that the Ner Tamid, the eternal light, is not burning. Oy. So what has he got? There's no help, there's no staff, nobody around, and what do I do? What do I do? What do I do? He said, he calls Rabbi Marks at home and he says, Rabbi, I hate to bother you on a Friday afternoon, but the eternal light has gone out. How do I deal with that? And Marx supposedly said, how should I know? It never burned out when I was the rabbi. I can't help but feel that that joke is apocryphal. And it's probably told by everybody, but it's a great story. So thanks to Rabbi Marks for giving us this next guy. Morris Newfield was from a smaller town in Hungary. He started out studying medicine, took a degree from the university in Budapest, and was set for that career. He decided to become a rabbi, and he emigrated to America to pursue study in the Reform movement with Rabbi Wise in Cincinnati. Even though he had a college degree, he did what everybody at HUC did. He took a degree also at the University of Cincinnati, so he was a very well-educated man by the time he hit Birmingham, Alabama in 1895. This was his only pulpit his entire life. 45 years in one thing. I would be remiss if I didn't make my observation that between 1895 and 1975, a period of 80 years, this congregation only had 2 rabbis. If you ever scratch your head about what makes this place so meshuggah, that probably has something to do with it. But then we had 3 and 15 years, so hey. All right. Anyway, Newfield was distinguished. He was teaching Talmud in Cincinnati when he was hired here to come and be rabbi of Temple Emanu-El. The only thing I can say about Newfield is really just to talk about highlights of who he was and how it fit with the Reform Judaism of the day. A lot of things we do remember about Rabbi Newfield. There's been quite a good scholarship about him. Is so congruent with the Reform movement of that era. The move to Highland Avenue was because we were here, and he was the rabbi when we made this move to where we are right now with these exterior walls that are, I not kid you not, 3 feet thick. This building was built to last. And this move was made in 1913 and it was dedicated in 1914. He was a chaplain at Fort McClellan during the First World War, something he was able to do and to help his country, to do service, and also retain his role here. His role in interfaith relations is entirely consistent with what Reform rabbis were about. Orthodox rabbis serve their community. They work for their community. Reform rabbis work and bring their community out to the larger community. That is a major focus of the Reform movement and has been. And Newfield was of that mold, which is not to say he didn't take care of his flock. Of course he did. But to the extent that he could motivate his flock, because theology was less important to these rabbis than actuating it in public service. You did Torah by going out and making the world better. Mitzvot were everything to classical Reform. It still is. The South Highland Presbyterian Church had a little split, doctrinal dispute. Right the same year that this temple was dedicated, Newfield lost no time approaching his friend Henry Edmonds, the senior minister, when he led a group of dissident Presbyterians out of that church and said, "Come here." They worshiped here for 7 years before they built their own building called the Independent Presbyterian Church. There's some interesting things about that church. The Presbyterian churches don't have presidents. That's not in their structure, but IPC does. And it was out of respect for Mr. Steiner, who so impressed them. They still to this day, it's an honorific, but it's a president. No Presbyterian churches have, I've worked for Presbyterians, they don't have presidents. They have 2 candelabra on either side of the altar at IPC. That's not normal, but look upstairs. These are tributes to the heritage that they gave. And it was not just that church, but this history has continued down to the day when we have hosted congregations all the way even through Rabbi Miller's time. They have worshipped here. And so this House of Prayer for All People is part of that Reform movement that began all the way back there. Later in his career, he and Monsignor Sands from St. Paul's Cathedral and Dr. Edmonds had a 3-way panel, the Catholic, the Protestant, and the Jew, and they did that kind of point-counterpoint thing, asking each other tough questions. It was all scripted, of course, but at the same time, educating people about all 3 of these faiths. He was involved in community chest. I've already talked about Independent Presbyterian Church. He was on the board of the Birmingham Conservatory of Music, one of my dear and near to be, because I worked for the heir apparent, which is the music department of Birmingham Southern, was the Birmingham Conservatory. And indeed, his choir director was the director of the Birmingham Conservatory, Benjamin Guckenberger. He was a classical Reform rabbi in changing times. And he was not a Zionist, but he passed away in 1940. And had he lived to see the full effects of what would transpire, I have no doubt that he would have seen that too, because he was nothing if not pragmatic and nothing if not a lover of Zion in the larger sense. I wish I'd known him. Probably one of the most important things he did was he gave us B.G. Menesman. B.G. is his grandson, but don't hold that against Rabbi Newfield. Okay? All in fun. But anyway, so in that sense, it's just hang around, B.G. It's good to have you here. All right, I've talked long enough. Now the fun begins.
Following the tenure of Rabbi Newfield in 1940, Rabbi Myron Silverman served a 1-year term here before resigning to serve as an Army chaplain. Then, Rabbi Milton Grafman was selected by unanimous decision from 75 highly qualified applicants. A Pittsburgh native, Rabbi Grafman arrived in Birmingham on December 8, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor Day. He said that it was a trying time to leave his congregation in Lexington, Kentucky, and a most difficult time to arrive at a new one here in Birmingham. At the time, our congregation was comprised of 325 families. Temple Emanu-El flourished under his guidance of 34 years as our rabbi and another 15 years as Rabbi Emeritus. It eventually grew to over 700 families. He was a towering force in both the Jewish community as well as the non-Jewish community in Birmingham. Rabbi Grafman was totally devoted to the rabbinate in this congregation. Alex Rittenbaum, a past president of the congregation and a very dear friend of Rabbi Grafman, once described him as a man who had so much to give that he literally could not stop giving. In addition, he was a dedicated husband and parent. He represented changing and challenging times, not only in Reform Judaism, but also in Birmingham as well. He walked quickly, rushing forward, both physically and philosophically. During World War II, he encouraged the congregation to buy war bonds in the name of the temple. When they matured, the money funded renovations to the sanctuary that included new carpeting and the beautiful stained glass windows that we all admire to this day. In addition, in 1966, Rabbi Grafman replaced the beautiful pipe organ that had been installed in 1913. When our longtime organist Herbert Grieve was unable to climb the steps to the choir loft and the organ, Rabbi Grafman appealed to the congregation and funds were quickly donated for an elevator to be installed. And Lester and I were reminiscing that we played with that elevator many, many times. Here is another tidbit about our sanctuary's history. The everlasting light that currently is hanging upstairs in our sanctuary was the original Ner Tamid at our north side building that succeeded this one. This one here in the chapel was originally hanging upstairs. Rabbi Grafman admired the beautiful multicolored one we all enjoy upstairs, so he simply had them switched. Ferdinand Seigel remembers the religious school when it was located in classrooms that surrounded the assembly hall, which became Stern Hall, and is now known as Wheel Hall. And it's really right around where we are, right at this very moment. As the religious school enrollment grew in size, 2 buildings were purchased on Highland Avenue at the far end of our current property next to the Berkeley apartment building. The one closest to the sanctuary was torn down, and that provided a gravel parking lot. The other house was converted into classrooms where many of us attended our early days of religious school. We have a photo of the temple. Then in 1955, construction was completed on the Rabbi Morris Newfield Education Building, which served us until 2001. I can still remember seeing Rabbi Newfield's 10-year-old grandson, B.G. Minnisman, it's a big day for you, B.G., having the honor of digging the first shovelful of dirt at the groundbreaking ceremony, followed by someone in the crowd yelling out, "Now dig the rest, B.G." When did you yell that? 1955.
That's when you yelled that?
I would say. Choir. That choir photo?
Yeah.
I also remember being a member of the children's choir at a Friday night service when we stood on the bema, which we used to call the altar, and turned to our left and sang, "Bless This House," in honor of our new educational building. And if you look at that picture, for some of you, you'll remember Lawrence Myers, who was our education director, Rabbi Grafman, and Florette Hirsch, who was our choir director, and Jeffrey Cohn's aunt. Rabbi Grafman thought we needed a smaller space for more intimate gatherings, as well as smaller services and weddings. And in 1962, the Carl Hess Chapel was created within the space of the educational building and served us well until our most recent renovation. Rabbi Grafman was a classical Reform Jew. He was both a strong and could be a fierce figure. He cared deeply about our congregation, where we were going, and about its members. Growing up here during that time, the congregation was stable. There was not much growth or change, and the makeup of the congregation was homogeneous. Because of Rabbi Grafman's strong Zionist views, he made most of the congregation at that time feel a connection to Israel, a position not all congregants agreed with. In the early days, he took tour groups to Israel, which were very popular. Rabbi Grafman had a strong sense of decorum and order. In his mind, he clearly knew what was best for our congregation. When you were confirmed or had a bar mitzvah, you were trained very carefully, and the staging of these events was impeccable, resulting in dramatic and near-perfect performances. Our fellow congregant, Lynn Otis Wilmoth, remembers that Rabbi Grafman would stand on the arms of the seats in the sanctuary and correct us during confirmation rehearsal. Some remember him using a whistle used for timing, and that led to some referring to him as Coach Grafman. There was a consistency to the services that proved to be very comforting. Now, I'd like to just ask Lester to stand next to me for just one moment, because as we were getting ready, and he was getting the slides ready this morning, we realized that we both remembered our bar mitzvah services. Mine was in 1961. You were
69.
Okay, so here we go. We shall continue our service on page 10. Lord of the universe, we lift up our hearts to thee, who made heaven and earth. The infinite heavens and the quiet stars tell of thine endless power. We turn from our daily toils, from its difficulties and its conflicts,
from its clamor and its weariness, to meditate on the serene calm of thy presence, which pervades all creation, and our hearts with the blessing of Sabbath peace.
We could go on. In confirmation class, he was our teacher. When he walked into the classroom, we would stand, and he would ask us to recite one of three things without notes as class began. It was either the 23rd Psalm, the 10 Commandments, long version, or the 39 books of the Bible, and you knew them. All of his notes and sermons were typed by him personally, and everything was meticulously organized. He kept scrapbooks of temple functions and accomplishments of our congregants in the community. He took great pride in our accomplishments. Rabbi Grafman was heavily involved with civic groups such as Spastic Aid of Alabama, a forerunner of United Cerebral Palsy, and was a strong supporter of the civil rights movement here in Birmingham. In 1963, he was one of 6 Birmingham clergymen who were invited to the White House to meet with President Kennedy to discuss racial problems here in Birmingham. For many of us, Rabbi Grafman had a profound effect on our lives, both personally and Jewishly. He was a cohesive force, and the fruits of his leadership continue to influence the congregation to this day. I have mentioned his love of this congregation and his total dedication to its members. He also had a great sense of humor and enjoyed music and sports. One of his great joys was following Alabama football, and he had been given 2 stadium certificates which gave him access to 2 tickets for games at Legion Field here in Birmingham, where Alabama played a number of its home games every year. You could count on his sermons to be shorter on the days that Lester claims that he had a 55-minute service on the Saturday of his bar mitzvah weekend because the Iron Bowl was that day. In all fairness, though, Lester, the main bar mitzvah service occurred on Friday nights. He was going to make that kickoff. He often took one of the religious school students with him, which was a very sought-after invitation. This occurred, he's speaking a night we honored him, and a lot of his students, bar mitzvah boys and so on, came back and had a service in his honor, and he told the story.
Then there was this personal relationship. I happen to be fortunate to have a stadium certificate. I really inherited it. Somebody bequeathed it to me. That's the truth. And so I have 2 good seats at Legion Field for any athletic event. And I've never sold a football ticket. I've always taken someone as my guest. A lot of people do nice things for rabbis. It's not easy for rabbis to reciprocate in kind. But one way that I was able to reciprocate was to take people to an Alabama game and sit on the 45-yard line, about row 40 or something like that. But I not only took adults, but I took kids. I realized then, I realize now, this was a big thing in their life. And yes, it was a thrill, because their parents used to tell me they'd love to ride in that fire engine red convertible. Now, one of the things I want to disabuse you of, it is not true what they went home and told their parents as far as this rate of speed at which I drove that. Not true. Say to a kid when you're riding 35 miles an hour, you know, from his perspective, it's got to be 75 miles. That's how they call it. parents or my grandparents said, well, he must be Barney Oldfield. I wonder if anyone old enough to remember Barney Oldfield.
Way better sound system than I did.
Yeah.
It's all jams. Her equipment.
Although he did not succeed, he encouraged
That sounds
any number of us to attend Hebrew Union College. It is not that he didn't try. In trying to convince us, he was always trying to show us
Then there was this
he led a very nice life. Cincinnati is the home of the American Reform Movement and the home of Hebrew Union College, the place where Rabbi Grafman was ordained and the place that inspired him. He wanted us, his students, to also get to a spiritual place like that. A very vivid memory from her days in confirmation class was shared with us by Susan Levin Schlechter, my sister, of New York City. She remembers Rabbi Grafman standing at the chalkboard during confirmation class and asking, how do you get from Birmingham to Cincinnati? Members of the class would then give answers such as, well, you could fly, or you could drive, or you could take a bus. Rabbi Grafman would write each one of these responses on the board with arrows connecting Birmingham and Cincinnati. Then he would turn and face the class and say, it's not how you get to Cincinnati. The important thing is that you get there. Following Rabbi Grafman's retirement, 3 rabbis then served Temple Emanu-El from 1975 to 1990. Rabbi Henry Bamberger had the tough job of being the first successor to Rabbi Grafman. This was sort of like Ray Perkins being the first coach following the tenure of the legendary coach Bear Bryant. And it's unclear to me which was the tougher job. But Rabbi Bamberger was very well received. He was scholarly, kind, soft-spoken in comparison, and more reserved. After 4 years, there was a mutual understanding, and he moved on to another congregation and had a long career as rabbi in Utica, New York. Rabbi David Zucker and Rabbi Steve Jacobs followed and touched the lives of many people in our congregation, but for various reasons, these relationships did not work out, creating some challenging times for our temple and our leadership. Our third long-standing rabbi, Jonathan Miller, joined Temple Emanu-El in 1991. Like Rabbis Newfield and Grafman, Jonathan was in his mid-30s when he became our senior rabbi. He served our congregation with distinction for 27 years until his retirement in 2017 when he became Rabbi Emeritus. Because many of us know Jonathan and because his time here was so recent, most of us are familiar with his accomplishments. Nevertheless, it is important to acknowledge some of the highlights of Jonathan's time here at Temple Emanu-El. Jonathan came to us from Stephen Wise' congregation in Los Angeles, where he had served for 9 years. Those of us on the search committee remember that Jonathan had a reputation as a social activist. We even heard that he had been arrested for chaining himself to a fence, along with others, in protest for the welfare of Soviet Jews. That feistiness appealed to us, and Jonathan brought that spirit and vigor with him to Birmingham as he became a spokesperson for the Jewish community and an involved member of the interfaith community. Jonathan was and is a well-respected member of the Jewish and non-Jewish community. He also, like his predecessors, helped make us comfortable to be Jewish in Birmingham. Rabbi Miller helped bring us up to date by bringing customs and rituals that were being observed by other Reformed Jewish congregations. He also introduced new prayer books, and later our clergy wrote an original prayer book, Offerings of the Heart, which we have used for the last 10 years. In 2001, our congregation underwent an extraordinary $13 million renovation of our sanctuary, along with construction of a new educational building that includes administrative offices, social halls, and this beautiful chapel. The $17.2 million fundraising campaign was remarkable for a congregation our size, and the unprecedented support of 82% of our congregation. Jonathan's vision and leadership played a key role in the success of that campaign. During the 14 months of the construction, we worshiped and had religious school at nearby Southside Baptist Church. Betty Goldstein and Barbara Seigel are among the many congregants who remember the extraordinary day we walked the tours in procession from our temple down Highland Avenue through 5 Points to the Southside Baptist Church. Jonathan's dear friend, Reverend Steve Jones, was there along with his fellow congregants to greet us as we arrived. And a very moving moment was when a banner was unfurled. The words on the banner were the same words from the prophet Isaiah that are etched on the side of our building "My house shall be a house of prayer for all people." Temple Emanu-El has also served as a spiritual home for a number of Christian congregations in our community. As Lester mentioned, Independent Presbyterian Church began its worship services in our sanctuary and worshiped here for 7 years before they built their beautiful church further down Highland Avenue. When they had a fire in 1992, we welcomed them back to Temple Emanu-El for 2 years during their reconstruction. Other churches have worshipped here as well, including South Highland Presbyterian, First Baptist Congregational, Baptist Church of the Covenant, Central Presbyterian, and Living Stones Congregation, in addition to Trinity AME Zion Church, which is currently having its worship services here. Jonathan started a successful program taking trips to Prague for confirmation students and families. In addition, he began helping lead friendship journeys to Israel for members of our temple, as well as the greater Jewish and non-Jewish community. These have been extraordinarily successful and popular. In 1995, Jonathan began conducting rejuvenation classes for those of all faiths interested in learning more about Judaism. Over the years, this class attracted a large number of people, Jews and non-Jews, from diverse backgrounds. Also, during Jonathan's tenure and with his support, the Grafman Endowment Fund grew from $400,000 to over $14 million. He has been one of its best ambassadors and biggest advocates of the importance of a strong endowment for a vibrant congregation. Beginning with the tenure of Rabbi Newfield, we had assistant rabbis serve our congregation, and some of you will remember the names of Rabbis Edward Cohn and Paul Feinberg. Most recently, Rabbis Scott Hausman-Weiss and Lila Haas served our congregation and were especially helpful in the areas of outreach and education. Speaking of education, we have had a number of outstanding education directors who have served our congregation over the years. Lawrence Myers and Margaret Lassico from the 1950s and 60s. Then Temple member Linda Cohn served for a number of years and was later followed by Lois Cohen, who did an outstanding job for 23 years. Now we are fortunate to have Linda Gutchen serving her 2nd year. In addition, our worship has been enriched by our outstanding music program. Many of us have fond memories of Herbert Grebe, who was our dedicated organist for many years. We used to have a choir that sang at all Friday night services, as well as a soloist who sang at Saturday morning services. Our own multi-talented, homegrown Lester Seigel became our organist and music director in 1984, and we were doubly blessed at that time when Lester's wife, Jane Seigel, became our cantorial soloist, and they worked together. Lucky us. When Jane joined us, her beautiful voice demonstrated to the congregation how uplifting, spiritual, and meaningful the addition of a cantor could be for our congregation. After serving the congregation for 13 years, Jane was followed by our first ordained cantor, Brian Miller, who added much to our service with his beautiful tenor voice during his relatively brief time with us. Then cantor Jessica Roskin joined us in 1999 and served our congregation beautifully, enriching our temple's programs and services for 20 years. We are now in the midst of an exciting search for our next new cantor. We have been so fortunate to have the very talented Paul Mosteller serve as our organist, pianist, and musical director since 1993. Paul initially began his association with our congregation as a member of the choir with Lester in 1989, 30 years ago. So, here we are. It's 137 years later. Our most recent search has brought us an outstanding rabbi from Detroit via Wheaton College. A master's degree from Vanderbilt, rabbinic ordination from Hebrew Union College, and a 5-year position as associate rabbi at Temple Solel in San Diego.
He has more head than that. I couldn't get the PowerPoint to behave. Sorry.
He is highly energized. He has big ideas of his own, including new and innovative worship experiences. Interestingly, he's about the same age that Rabbis Newfield, Grafman, and Miller were when they arrived at Temple Emanu-El. Rabbi Wright, you are inheriting a rich history and a congregation that is excited about the future. We look forward to being a part of this next chapter in our temple's history.